Meeting to order, and may I have a roll call, please?
Why, certainly. Mr. Britton, thank you. Mr. Mack.
Here.
Mr. Schaller.
Here.
Ms. Bourne.
Here.
Mr. Matuzak.
Here.
Mr. McCarthy.
Here.
Mr. Smith.
Here.
Mr. Van Hoosen.
Here.
Well, I've got the wrong two. Mr. Kuhlman.
Here.
And then Jan Materney.
There.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, and I believe everyone has received a copy of the May 7th, 2019 meeting minutes for the joint cemetery meeting. I have not heard anything or received anything on any changes on that, so I'd be happy to entertain a motion.
Mr. Smith, also Mr. President, I'd like to mention that I recall from that meeting that Mr. Mack had indicated that we needed to keep our heritage regarding the cemetery and regarding the fence. We needed to consider that, and that's not in the notes.
This comment included in that meeting last time, or?
Mr. Mack, I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I just recall that.
What was it, Deborah? I missed that.
You had indicated at the last meeting that we had that there was discussion about the fence at the cemetery, and you had indicated that we needed to keep our heritage and we need to be cognizant of that.
I did say that.
Yes. Regarding the fence.
Did it end in the record then, or?
I think it should be added.
Probably should be.
So is that a motion to add that?
Yes,
in there?
please.
All right, can I have a roll call, please?
Okay. Mr. Britton.
Yes.
Mr. Mack.
Yes.
Mr. Schaller.
Yes.
Ms. Bourne.
Yes.
Mr. Matuzak.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy.
Yes.
Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Mr. Van Hoosen.
Yes.
Mr. Kuhlman.
Yes.
Ms. Materney.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, can I have a motion to approve the amended meeting minutes?
So moved.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Okay, and roll call again. Mr. Britton.
Yes.
Mr. Mack.
Yes.
Mr. Schaller.
Yes.
Ms. Bourne.
Yes.
Mr. Matuzak.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy.
Yes.
Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Mr. Van Hoosen.
Yes.
Mr. Kuhlman.
Yes.
Ms. Materney.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I know everyone has received a copy of the 2020 cemetery budget, and I was hoping that the chairman of the cemetery may be able to come up and answer any questions that the committee may have, and say anything in regards to the cemetery at this time. So, Mr. Warnebaum.
Thank you. We did send out the budget to everybody ahead of time to look over, to see what we've been doing out there at the cemetery, and hopefully everybody had an opportunity to look at it and agree with what we are agreeing with, hopefully. So a couple things about the cemetery, what's going on. Number one, we had a water problem on the north side, which the city is working with us. As soon as they get some time again, they're going to come back with a new type of jet to go through it. Jet head, I should say. The other thing we did find out this year, and from some unknown reason, we had a septic tank out there. So we had to eliminate our septic tank, and they ran the line into the sewer, but now we're having a little problem with backdraft of smell coming back through the system. So between regional and the person who put it in, they working with it, try to solve that problem. So other than that, things at the cemetery is going pretty decent. As you know, COVID-19 spoiled everything for everybody. There's a lot of things the guys wanted to get done, they couldn't get done because when this hit, we split our 6 people up. We made 3 on one day and 3 on the next day, and we worked them on a Saturday to get their hours. Just in case one of the groups would have got sick, we still had 3 people to run our cemetery. So that's how we stand right now. Jonathan's on the board, and Gary, if they got something to add.
What I'll say is I believe that the staff of the cemetery has done an exemplary job of handling themselves throughout this COVID-19 pandemic. It's It's been difficult, I know for certain for them, especially with breaking up the staff, but it was a necessary precaution we had to take. If one group had to go in quarantine, that's 14 days without employees. If you notice on the budget as well, there was a couple changes that were made from the initial budget that we discussed due to this, and knowing that everyone has to be tightening their belt a little bit. There was a potential cold storage unit that we have removed for the time being as a short-term move, just to help keep an eye on the cost. If there is any openings that come up, we would look at not hiring immediately, but down the road, at least temporarily on this. And one thing to take into account when we look at the budgets in the future, for the most part, it has typically shown a loss on there as a deficit, but usually what we end up seeing is 9 times out of 10, those deficits turn into surplus with how much the cemetery actually pitches their pennies and their dollars, and they usually do a good job of doing that. I think the biggest cost is health insurance overall to the cemetery for the staff.
On that note, was the cemetery eligible for, and if so, did it apply for any financial assistance due to the pandemic?
We did have a discussion, but I don't believe that the cemetery would fall under the eligibility due to it being a government entity at the time. But if there's anything that pops up here, I know we had that discussion here tonight in the council that we can have potentially at the cemetery.
Okay, I would pursue it. If there's eligible money out there, I would pursue it. Someone's going to get it.
I would say through this crisis, our guys and ladies did a super job out there at the cemetery to maintain it to the best of their ability through COVID-19 and all the rain we did have. So
Sure.
it's just like the city and township had the same problems to deal with everything. So
But you're a victim of the government's reaction to the pandemic and financial victim. And so I would think that there would be some money that you would be eligible for. If you haven't already, then you should be down the road. Governmental unit, we're going to pass something tonight that provides financial assistance to the city. Township's probably doing the same thing, and we're governmental units, so I wouldn't fail to pursue that.
we will pursue that. We got a meeting tomorrow. We will bring it up at the meeting and pursue it.
Okay.
Yeah,
One of the things I'd like to add, Bob, is everybody knows spring for the cemetery is the busiest time. And it's really been hard for these guys to get, the crews to get the work done when we cut them down to 3 guys on a day and, you know, till we could get them back here a couple of weeks ago all together. But they did a well of job. I know Tom's had some concern about not getting enough weed eating done and stuff like that, but, so if anybody asks you, that maybe they think the cemetery isn't as pristine as it normally is, there's a reason for it. These crews, they just work their tails off to get this stuff done, so.
Mr. Britton, I would comment, as a person who has relatives and friends that are at the cemetery, on occasion you go out there, and I think it's maintained very well.
Good, good.
I drive by it 6 or 8 times a day, and I've never noticed that it's not well maintained, so.
Hear that, Tom? He takes that like it's his baby, so, and that makes it good.
Yeah,
Sure does.
Yeah,
Sure does.
And we appreciate your comments thinking that way because, as everybody know, what Gary just said, that's Tom's baby. And when the baby don't get what it wants, then Dad's a little unhappy. And Tom tries to get everything for Memorial Day to be super out there, which they did probably 80% of the stuff he wanted to get done, but he wanted 100%. So. Anybody else got any questions?
I would add that I think Mr. Freese puts 100% along with his staff into the cemetery from what I've observed.
Yes, they do. More than 100% sometimes, because sometimes, like when they pour in footers, they don't waste time. If it's a break time or whatever, they just keep pouring concrete. And if I remember right, Tom, you had 40 some this time?
Yeah.
So that's a lot of concrete to get in the ground in 8 hours, so. Thank you.
Can't recall here, do we have to vote to approve the budget, correct? Okay, thank you. At this point, I would like to entertain a motion to approve this budget.
I'll make a motion to go ahead and approve the 2020 cemetery budget.
Actually, Gary, that's a misprint on the original agenda that went out. It's the 2021 budget that you're approving tonight.
That's amended.
Do we have a second, sir?
I'll second.
Roll call.
Okay, Mr. Britton,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Schaller,
Yes.
Ms. Bourne,
Yes.
Mr. Matuzak,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Van Huzen,
Yes.
Mr. Coolman,
Yes.
and Ms. Materney.
Yes.
Thank you.
At this point of the agenda, we do have the appointment to the cemetery board, and I can't recall who's up. I don't think we ever remember who's up at this point.
Actually, that's another misprint from the original agenda. I looked it up this afternoon. I had Elaine look it up. It happens to be your term that's up.
Okay.
So the next question is whether you're willing to serve another 3-year term.
Now, if the board up here would be willing to put me up for another 3 years, I'd be more than happy to do it. But if anybody else has any other suggestions or thoughts, I'd be open to hear.
I nominate Jonathan Smith.
I second that nomination.
Real quick, any discussion? Roll call.
Okay, Mr. Britton,
Yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Schaller,
Yes.
Ms. Bourne,
Yes.
Mr. Matuzak,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Van Huzen,
Yes.
Mr. Coolman,
Yes.
Ms. Materney.
Yes.
Very good, thank you.
All right, so the next item on the agenda is a vote to continue the .32 mills. I'd be at this time entertaining a motion for that.
Excuse me, Jonathan, before you do that, what is that specifically? What does that cover, so everybody
And it's
knows?
covering pretty much the entire cost of operating and maintaining the
So let me
cemetery.
ask this question, is that in the budget that we just passed?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so,
So probably be good to,
But I don't think this has changed in, how many years now?
well, it's been on the books for a long time. Some of you will remember there was a point in time where we diverted some of that inside millage of both the city and township. I don't remember what the exact amount was, but we diverted a part of that away from the cemetery and then had to kind of reinstate it back in. But we held the inside millage to our own groups, you know what I mean? So that like somebody else couldn't come along and take that inside millage because, you know, you only get so much and it's spoken for. So technically, it's been on the books for a long time, but there was a period in time a few years back that we diverted some of that, so that's the long answer to a short question.
So at this point, I'd entertain a motion to approve the continuing of the review mills. Roll call.
Okay, Mr. Britton,
yes.
Mr. Mack,
Yes.
Mr. Schaller,
Yes.
Ms. Bourne,
Yes.
Mr. Matuzak.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy.
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Van Huzen,
Yes.
Mr. Coolman,
Yes.
Ms. Materney.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, so with any other pertinent business, I know last meeting we had a conversation with the fence. We had a conversation at the board that we were hoping that the joint meeting here tonight, we could look at a direction on what the city and the township would like us to pursue on this fence. Has been unfortunately quite a bit of conversation, but to do a complete replacement of it seems to be, for the most part, pretty cost prohibitive at this point. And so what we wanted to see is how the joint meeting here, what everyone's thoughts are and how we should proceed with the fence. Should we look at just repairing it as we can, and should we look at removing portions of it, and how do we go, where we look at from here? I know we've talked about this last meeting a year ago, as we all saw on there, and just kind of like to get some direction from everyone's thoughts on here today. I know just to give history on this, for those who were involved in this conversation before, with the fence out there, per the city code, You can only repair up to 10% of that fence at any given time. To do a complete replacement, because it's considered 3 front yards, you cannot put a chain link fence in that per the city code as well. And I believe that you have to get approval from the planning zone department to put the fence in. They have to have certain setbacks and so forth. So it's a very unique situation that we have, and just wanted to get some insight from the board here as we talk about this in a smaller setting.
My thoughts, Mr. President and Mr. Smith, would be that I don't think we should replace the fence. If it need be fixed what is currently there, keep within the holes that are there and do that little by little. But I don't know what the cost would be on that, to look into that, but I don't think we should be replacing the fence. That's getting into making the cemetery look like a Disneyland, which we don't want. I think we need to keep it in our heritage, and that fence has been there forever and ever and ever.
If there was thoughts of potentially removing the fence, would that be any concern?
Yes, it would.
Jonathan, is that 10% per year?
Per year. So it'd be a 10-year project to slowly fix that fence if you want to do it within what's allowable in the code.
Mr. McCarthy, with the cemetery, I'm asking you because you've head of the planning and zoning committee for quite a while. Does the cemetery, is there an avenue they can pursue to look like a variance, or is it something that they can pursue doing something other than what?
I'm not sure I heard all that, Jim. Is there a, what?
Is there some avenue that the cemetery could pursue to fix or replace or repair more than 10%, even though that's what the code says, like request a variance or some kind of special allowance that allows them to do it because they have a unique situation? And, you know, when the rules were drafted, they, you know, painted everyone with the same brush, but there are people that have unique facts and circumstances, and in this case, 3 front yards, which was not anticipated, I'm sure, when it was written, where they can get some type of an allowance or a variance to go ahead and do something.
Well, I'm sure we could amend the zoning code in some fashion to make that happen, but I don't think we ever reached the point of needing really to think about that, because all the options that were in front of us were very costly. And if memory serves me, I thought Tom came up with a pretty good plan to just maintain the current fence and repair as he went. I don't know if I remember that right or not, but, so we never really got to that issue, John.
Well, you would have to amend the code to just provide for.
There's 2 issues that are presented in the front yard. The number 1 issue is actually the fact that in the front yard you can't have chain link fence. And initially that's what we had looked at as the cemetery, was replacing it with a new chain link fence, but it's completely prohibited.
What's the address of the cemetery? Does it have 3 addresses?
No.
620 West Indiana.
West Indiana.
Right.
I would
So how could
think,
one parcel line have 3 front yards? It's got 1 address.
There are lots of houses in Perrysburg that have 3 front yards.
my thoughts would be, if I may, Mr. President, I would think on this that it would be grandfathered with the current fence that is currently there.
And that's why you can
We're
repair.
not suggesting we take it down because it's not compliant.
And I understand we actually had Brody Walters and come out and talk about that as well. I think he had the planning and zoning committee to talk about that, and I want to blank on the names of everyone who's come out. We've had so much conversations on these. I don't remember every name of everyone who's come out, but the issue is, according to the planning and zoning department, is once you remove something that has been there, it has to come up to code at that point.
Yeah.
And that's where we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because
Yeah, we make the rules.
so and
We can change the rules. We can do whatever we want. You know.
it'd have to come out of planning and zoning at that
Yeah.
point.
Well, we can't. I mean, my opinion is we're sitting here trying to figure out what we can do based on all the limitations that we placed on ourselves.
Yeah.
Well,
I think Mr. Freeze had a good idea by just wanting to do a little bit at a time with the fence that's currently there, just putting and replacing it, putting in the current holes that are there. I think that's a good idea.
I'm pretty easy to get along with. I'm willing to do whatever, you guys decide you want to do, but I just feel kind of weird sitting here telling myself that I can't do something because I've made it so I can't do something. Or, we're trying to figure out how to get around something that we created ourselves.
The easiest but longest option is going to be to replace it in increments. The other option would be is if we're doing just repairs on the specific fence itself, that would be something I think would have to look at the planning and zoning on what can be done to make amendments to that.
So the finances, are they really an issue for the cemetery since, from what I understand, the majority of it comes from tax levy on real estate?
It is definitely the issue, especially with.
We're going to see the revenues go down from real estate tax collections?
The revenues will stay pretty consistent, but what the issue tends to be is the increasing cost of everything else to maintain and run the cemetery. With the health insurance really being one of the biggest issues, as we all are aware.
So there are some financial constraints, but they're not because of the COVID-19.
Not for the long term.
No.
Okay.
Short term, yeah.
Because I'm just thinking the city is making a lot of sacrifices on capital expenditures this year because of this. And we're talking about a capital expenditure for the cemetery, but if there are financial restrictions, they're for different reasons.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that we should consider ourselves lucky that if you had to fix the whole fence at once, then you had that roll instead. We couldn't afford it. So, I mean, the reality is, we get to spread our repairs over 10 years, which probably works much better for our skinny budget. So
if I hear correctly, we'd be looking at doing incremental replacements and repairs of that fence.
over time, in accordance with the current city code.
That's comparable to the multi-family, correct?
Yeah.
My question is, where are we gonna find the money? We don't have the money in the cemetery budget.
You can believe.
Even to do 10%.
And I'm pointing up at the ceiling where the speakers are, so I think Councilwoman Attorney has a comment.
I was just going to back up what you said. That fence is cast iron. That is very expensive material.
Like that.
She said it was cast iron and it was very expensive for those who did not hear.
Parts of that.
Sorry about that.
What was the chain for the whole cemetery? 40,000?
That was pretty much all I had to say. The expense, doing it incrementally when they can afford it is probably the better option.
I think,
It's 40,000 for the chain link to change it, whereas that plastic, it'd be chain link, so we will not have to maintain it and paint it and all that.
it'd be vinyl covered.
Vinyl cover like the schools put, which that'd be ideal to do. But
Time you come to the mics, I don't think Jan might not be able to hear you.
Either one.
Either one's fine.
it's 40,000 for the chain link and the vinyl. So that's what we're looking at versus,
Complete replacement.
That's for a complete replacement, and if we do it over time, you can divide that by 10, but you know that over time, the cost is going to be higher than that.
it'd be going up every year, yeah.
And as some may be aware, there's been a couple instances where that fence has been hit on Front Street, where there was some damage on there. I know that the stone wall was hit on 25 as well. And then there's just other areas where the tree roots are getting away or the ground is settled around it and it just is sticking out different parts of it.
We painted it about 20 years ago. You look at it now, it's starting to rust pretty good. So,
Mr. Priest, is there any way that perhaps you could paint the current existing fence that's there? Black?
well, that's what I brought up, but that's when they said is, go ahead, Gary.
If you get out and look at it, it's not worth throwing good money on something that's not worth putting it on. I mean, if you got a building falling down, you know, I'm gonna put a coat of paint on, we gotta fix the building first. So, to me, I wouldn't put a nickel into messing with what's there, other than if you wanna take it out and repair the sections.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. I was
But as
getting to
far
that
as
next.
trying to go back and repaint and everything,
Mhm.
that's, you might as well use that towards new fence.
Well, I mean, I think if we're going to be doing a lot of spending of money for the cemetery, I agree with, the health interests are definitely needing to be considered. I think that should be first and foremost. I agree with Mr. Mack that we should do the increments within the 10 years.
And the biggest thing is just trying to find that in the budget at this point. And I don't know if there's any conversation or discussion we might be able to have on that. But unfortunately, that's the other big issue that we have, you know, with the,
But I would stipulate keeping it within the holes that are currently already there, rather than,
with the footprint when it changes, there was going to be a replacement of it.
I just heard a little bit earlier that we always budget a deficit, we always end up with a surplus. How much is that surplus every year that we end up with?
Well, this last year it wasn't a surplus. On this, there was actually a $36,000 deficit, but there was a couple unintended purchases that occurred prior. In 18, it was a $30,000 surplus, and 17, it was a $37 surplus, and that was
$7.
$37,000. Sorry.
I'm lost. We can't figure out how to come up with $4,000 when we had a surplus of $37,000 that we did in your budget.
So again, if you look on the budget here on health insurance, that has been going up. Let's see here, where's that listed up here? That has been going up about 5 to 10% every year, if I recall correctly. And we've had some pretty significant increases on that as well. And there's a couple potential employee retirement where there's going to be some larger expenses coming down the road with having.
I'm not trying to argue, but
Yeah.
the comment was made before we passed the budget that while it shows a deficit, we usually end up with a surplus, and the implication being that we may end up with a surplus. Or I don't see the purpose of making that comment, so we may end up with a surplus. What's the surplus that we think we may end up with? And is that enough to repair part of the fence?
but
Hopefully it would be, but
There's different signals.
the question I would say then, you know, moving forward as some of the expenses continue to go up and with the penny pitching that the staff has done, there's only so much you can pinch pennies when some of these health insurance expenses, other expenses continue to go up, that eventually that's going to potentially change. We're going to have some serious conversations. Now, the question I would have is, you know, let's say that this year we end up with a surplus, but next year we don't, and it's negative. We can't do those repairs. That's going to push that off one more year. Is that something that we can have those conversations then on a yearly basis on how we take care of the fence? See if there's ways to help with contributing towards the cemetery to help with those costs? Because when I look at the cemetery, it is a focal point coming in across the Maumee-Perrysburg Bridge, and we want to make certain that that looks great coming in.
No, I don't disagree with that at all.
To be honest with you, most people when they come in are not looking to see how the fence looks in the cemetery. They're driving by, they know that's a place that they go past, but most people don't think about what the fence looks like at the cemetery. They really don't.
I don't know, we talked about the cemetery, so I hope that's true. So if
It
it's
is.
not, then we still need to make certain that the fence still looks presentable. What I say we can do is if it comes down to it and if funds become a problem, we bring it back on a yearly basis. Is everyone comfortable with that?
Yeah, well, 2021 shows a projected surplus of 13,000.
Yeah, and that was with some of the changes that we had made, potentially not retiring someone.
Yeah.
If there is a spot that opens up this year, there's also, we removed the cold storage as the cemetery continues to grow in space. You know, there seems to be more equipment in there. There's more tombstones come up. It takes even longer to maintain the property. And then there was a change in the wage increases down to 1.5%. So initially it wasn't looking this way, but we made some changes and some cuts to try to make sure that we're showing a surplus. But then again, that may not be the case moving forward. There's a lot of unknowns coming ahead
I'm just going to rephrase I think your question is what kind of direction are we trying to give the board, right?
Yes.
Which is either we establish a capital reserve for replacement or we set our path towards repair over the long term. I think that's specifically your question.
Yeah, and it sounds to me that everyone up here is looking to do the repair and replace where needed over that 10% over the long-term planning, but there may be circumstances as we move forward where that's going to show a deficit, where it's going to make that more difficult to do.
Certain years.
Yes.
And that may be the reality we face.
Tim, is this still something we can kick to planning and zoning committee to make sure we don't run into any issues there as far as replacement?
Well, it's been there before, but it really never, Jonathan, you were on the committee, and you'll remember, it never really became decisional, because we didn't really have any definitive idea. I mean, I think the last time it came to committee is when we ended up, Rhodey went out to meet with the cemetery board to kind of give the cemetery board an idea of what options might be available.
Yeah, and that was one of the options was replacement at 10%
Yeah.
over the course of a 10-year period to completely replace it.
Because I'm kind of with Jim on this. I don't like the fact that we're limiting our options kind of on our own volition. So if we can do something to give some sort of exemption. So if we do have, say we have extra surplus other than that 13,000 where we can attack bigger portions on certain years, I would rather the city not be.
Maybe that's something to talk
In-
about
in
planning
a way.
and zoning committee then, have that conversation, look at the code at that point. I know we're over time at this point, and I really want to be conscious of that. So what I would just suggest then, I know I'm putting a different hand in here, but have that conversation, one of the planning and zoning committees to look at what the code says and what reliefs are possible, but we have to be conscious that if we do this for the cemetery, it's going to have to be for more than just one location as well.
Well, I think, but then that takes our cohorts over here from the trustees out of the decision-making process, and I think they need to be part of the process with this.
But I think that it would be, but ultimately we're looking to see what we can do to help expedite the time frame, and let's say that, if I understand what you're
I just want to look at it in committee so that we're not tripping on our own.
I think what we're going to look at moving forward, if I understand this, is to look at doing repairs and replacements as we can each year. And then if there's the ability for the city to come up with another solution, we can hopefully move forward with that. And if that does occur by next year, then we can have the conversation on how we fund it at that point. Does that seem sufficient for everybody?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
All right. Any other business regarding the cemetery? I know we got long-winded there.
Keep it as it is, and keep our heritage, as to quote Mr. Mack from the last time, I'm in agreement with you. We need to keep our heritage and keep that cemetery looking as nice as it is now. Thank you to the staff and Mr. Freeze. And I don't think we need to veer away from that.
All right. Thank you. If I have a motion of adjournment.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.